Oh, ugh, that's awful. Hello, peoples. I do apologise. It's very bad light here. There's not really an awful lot I can do about it. It's winter in the UK and it's very dark, even though it's mid-afternoon here. So, sorry and on all that. Once you lot start clicking on the ads on these things, then I might actually get some money from Google, it might then enable me to buy a little light thing so that then my winter videos will look a bit better. But sorry about that anyway. Right, so yeah, today I'm in a rather privileged position of being able to show you this is a limited edition first release mono white album. Oh gosh, it's actually making me look a little bit better. So if I just hold it like this all the time, then it will reflect some of the light from the window that's coming in here, and it makes me look better. So yeah, anyway, this is a mono white album. The mono version was originally, as an album, only released in the UK because most places by then, most of the record companies only wanted stereo copies of their things. Certainly this was never released in mono in the US. By that time, people's record players had changed somewhat. You will damage a stereo record by playing it on a mono record player with a mono cartridge. However, by that time, even the cheap mono record players were coming with very, very cheap stereo cartridges that could be wired up to sound in mono, and the stylus would have a point that was small enough to be able to track stereo records correctly without damaging them. So after the White Album, it wasn't necessary for the Beatles to do any more specific mono albums, and they never did what was called a foldback album, which was where you just took the stereo track and combined it down to one track for mono. They always made different mixes of their songs because in stereo, for example, a voice that's on the left in stereo or on the far right in stereo will, once it's been sort of mixed in, will sound too loud for a mono mix, and so they always did it slightly differently, which is why, yes, the mixes on here do sound slightly different because they've had to try and sort of exploit the virtues of a mono record player and listening in mono for a mono album here. There are some other sort of oddities which, as we talk about the album, I'll go through here. So yeah, this has got a limited edition number on it. It's 176635, which means it doesn't put it of all the, because the first million mono and the first million stereo copies were given a dedicated number, which on my 80s copy is obviously not there because, obviously they sold 1 million in the first day. But yeah, number 1 and I think numbers 1 to 10 or something like that are extremely valuable. Go for, £20,000 or something like that. Whereas, the later numbers, anything above 10,000 or something, will go for a few hundred. I just saw one on eBay the other day going for £160 that, like this one, has lost its photos. This one has lost its photos. There's a poster in here which has been put together by, or being held together by extremely old sticky tape. One of the black inner sleeves has been lost. And to cap it all, back in the USSR is slightly damaged on here, so it probably wouldn't get a lot on eBay. It belongs to a friend of mine. They've asked me to transfer it, which is why I'm sitting here with it, because I wouldn't be buying it myself at this moment in time. But yeah, I'm really, really glad to have found this. If you just want to hear it in mono, then get the box set of mono 2009 remasters. I think that's about the only way you can hear the mono version. No, I don't even think it's available on iTunes, but I could be wrong. So this was made, and this cover is a complete statement of the Beatles' intent at that time, because their 1967 albums, this was 1968, late 1968, but their 1967 albums were basically saying to everybody, drop an acid tab, LSD for those people who aren't sure, but and you'll have a good trip listening to the Beatles music and everything, and it was colourful and swirly whirly and everything, and you had the Beatles there in mock military regalia and that sort of thing, really pissing off the middle classes with the fact that Britain was just coming out of the World War, suffered really, really badly for it and everything, and you've got the sons and daughters of the World War that are basically saying, look, for God's sake, let's get over it, and almost taking the piss out of it. And certainly, you've got the Vietnam thing as well, where nobody wants to join Vietnam and everything, and it's the youth and the counterculture, and it was very, very powerful. And the Beatles were basically there, just basically taking the mickey out of anything that was remotely to do with, I grew up in the war, and get your hair cut sort of thing. There they are, long hair people, icons of the world there, in mock, multicoloured soldier regalia and everything. And then to cap it all, they took a bus around Britain, and Magical Mystery Tour was essentially what Britain would look like on acid. And again, there's a scene in there where they go into an army camp and everything, and they're basically, really are taking the Michael, something chronic. Now, there's no colour whatsoever here at all. You can barely make out the name The Beatles here in sort of raised print, a bit like you have the dots of Braille. You might be lucky enough to have this little number here, but there's nothing else here to tell you that this is a Beatles record. And I'd imagine that, because I don't do drugs and I don't approve of them at all, but I'd imagine that if you were to take an acid tab to this, you would have a really awful trip, because to me it just shrieks, to my, I suppose, relatively sober mind, it just shrieks of absolute sort of horror and macabreness. And what had happened, the Beatles had virtually, they'd opened this Apple record label, which was losing money hand over fist. They'd virtually fallen apart. Their relationships were quite difficult during 1968 and 1969. And last year I did a video on Abbey Road, which sort of was really going for, the relationship side of their partnership, and really fallen to pieces by this time. And by 1968, which was the year before Abbey Road, you've got 4 separate Beatles here in relatively subdued clothing, trendy but relatively subdued. Ringo's outfit here, which you would see on the coloured photos if you had them, but it's a little bit bright yellow and that sort of thing. But by and large, it's very, very subdued compared to what it was before, because you'd also got sort of world events at this time. The Summer of Love was just a dream that most of us had, as Joni Mitchell said. You've got Czechoslovakia being invaded. You've got this, the Russian sort of superpower situation going on. You've got rock concerts where people are getting sort of trampled to death. I think the Rolling Stones, it was either the Rolling Stones or the Who, did a concert in Hyde Park where fans got trampled to death, which wasn't particularly good, obviously. You've got, after this album had been released, some nutter took acid and was told in his acid trip basically to go ahead and murder somebody. So he took, I think it was Piggies, one of George Harrison's songs on here, and decided to use that as evidence to murder somebody. I do beg your pardon. I'll try not to talk too much, okay? But yeah, so this album is the absolute antithesis, shall we say, of Sgt. Pepper. I'm going to go through some of my highlights. I might not talk in depth about every track because that would just bore you to pieces. All right, but back in the USSR, I can't hold it like that forever. Sorry. Back in the USSR, that's how the album starts. Relatively upbeat. It is worth noting that Ringo Starr found that the atmosphere was awful during the White Album, and he actually walked out. And the drumming on this track is actually Paul's drumming, because Paul liked playing the drums basically, and Ringo had enough during that. So yeah. But again, this is taking the piss. Paul taking the piss out of the Russian sort of regime here, basically, look at all you Soviets and everything, pretending to be all Soviet and communist and everything, but you've got lovely girls, basically. And it was actually interesting to note that in the 80s, Paul McCartney actually had an album officially released there, and Back in the USSR was one of the tracks, but they renamed it Back in Old Russia, because the Soviets still couldn't quite cope with the portrayal that they were getting on here, it's Paul being a rebel in the 80s, having that album, something like Chopa SSSR, I think they called it, something like that. But basically, he must have just been right pissed off at that, and having to cave in as well, when basically he's really sticking two fingers up to the Soviet regime there, and that's how basically it starts. Every track, a bit like Sgt. Pepper here, every track sort of melts into the other one, and as the aircraft lands here, we go into Dear Prudence, which was John wrote a lot of songs while he was with the other Beatles. They went in early 1968. They went off to India to be the guests of the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. John Lennon was rather disillusioned by it, and some of the tracks here are expressing John's disillusionment with it. There's also the fact that Cynthia Lennon was there. His marriage was falling apart at the time, and he was spending rather a large portion of the day taking long walks down to the village post office to see whether there was any mail from Yoko. That's if you believe Cynthia's biographies. So Dear Prudence then is, I think, addressed to Maya Farrow, but it's kind of, to me, suggesting that perhaps prude, the word prude in English, if you call someone a prude, then you mean that they're a little bit sort of sexually shy, maybe, and so therefore Dear Prudence, Won't You Come Out to Play is John still feeling a little bit sort of sexually aroused, whatever, and everybody else around, is obviously sort of abstaining and everything, and he's feeling a little bit sort of leery, as it were, and beautiful, lovely guitar work, and it's just a lovely, lovely song. And Susie and the Banshees took a sort of rather heavier approach to it in the mid 80s when they did a cover version of it. A good song, one of their lesser known ones. This is what I like about this album, really, is that there were no single releases from it at all, and so it contains a lot of lesser known stuff. At least there were no UK singles from here. Glass Onion is John name checking a lot of songs, but trying to bust the Beatles myth. Again, you see, you've got all these acid heads that are taking stuff and they're like, "Oh, was the walrus?" and and trying to make out that the Beatles were more than they were. They basically just spent hours in the studio drinking cups of tea and making records, and people couldn't get the hang of that, and he's trying to bust that myth, and using a lot of Paul's songs, actually, like The Fool on the Hill, Who's There Still, and who was the other one? Fixing a Hole in the Ocean, and all that sort of thing, where it's basically just trying to bust the myth a bit, I think. Because certainly he began to find recording with the Beatles at Shaw, and I think there was a point where George, he used to get on well with George, and George did a lot of stuff with him during the 70s, but there was a time where he would not record a single thing that George wanted to do, or he would find it, it was always too much effort to go and record any of George's stuff, and George got very resentful of it. So after Glass Onion, we've got some bizarre sort of Mellotron-y style or orchestral sounds that have been where the tapes are slowing up and slowing down, which is done on purpose. Suddenly, Oh Bloody Oh Bloody. Now this is another thing. Now when the Beatles were recording, much sort of hype goes to the fact that they, certainly in their early recordings, if they made a mistake, they just recorded the song again. And there was nothing you could do about it. You might get the odd tape splice here and there, or whatever, but you certainly couldn't spend hours and hours and hours recording and perfecting stuff and editing out mistakes and copying a bit of tape from here to there and the next thing. By Revolver, that is most definitely what they were doing. And by Sgt. Pepper was a great tour de force of copying 4 tracks of a 4-track tape machine onto 1 track of another 4-track tape machine, then recording the 4 tracks again and copying it over. And certainly that was how it was built up, and it was a major recording triumph, really, just from the point of view of we're not playing it live anymore, gang. This is basically a recording. And the White Album, even though it hasn't got that sort of psychedelic sound or anything like that, it was worse in terms of the amount of time that they would spend on it. And Oh Bloody Oh Bloody was Paul McCartney, and I can imagine that song must have just it sounds great to hear it once or twice or whatever, and hasn't it got a lovely tune, everybody? And as I was a child and I first heard this song, I thought, oh, isn't it great? And walked around the house singing it all the time. I must have driven the adults crazy in my household at that time. And for the Beatles to have spent weeks and weeks on this song, trying to perfect it and everything, and Paul is, I don't know whether it's a myth or not, but Paul is reported of saying, well, how on earth do we start this song? And John, just so fed up and frustrated, just gets on the piano and goes dang 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 dang, and then oh great, yeah, we'll do it like that then, because it was I think it drove people crackers at the time, and certainly this album took a lot longer to make, and none of the Beatles would give. This is why it's a double album, because it's 4 Beatles, each wanting their own songs on here, and just getting the other 3 Beatles to play with them. It's not like where there are many sort of In My Life kind of collaborations or Day Trippers or anything like that, where this is a Lennon and McCartney song. These were Lennon and McCartney only by name now. It was either John's or Paul's. Luckily, George might get a look in somewhere, and even Ringo got a look in on this album. But it was certainly 4 egos, which is why you've got these 4 separate photos here. There's very little, even on the poster, of 4 Beatles together. So, yeah, Oh Bloody Oh Bloody. I think everybody was just pissed off with it. And you can see why, really. We next get a little burst of Wild Honey Pie. A lot of jamming, obviously, went on. And the jams were, really bizarre at times. And it was something that they'd been doing since Revolver times, really. And also getting little tape loops together and making bizarre sound effects and all that sort of thing. And Wild Honey Pie is obviously, you can hear there's an edit right towards the very end where they bring it together, but it's just a minute or 2 little sort of throwaway, really, but except that it's really good. It's just for all its few seconds length, it's really good. We have the continuing story of Bungalow Bill, which is John and Yoko arguing that it's actually not right to go hunting and killing people and whatever. And they were starting their peace campaign, and you do have Yoko on there, and that must have been something that the Beatles were not happy about, or the rest of the Beatles were not happy about, because they weren't even happy that by now she'd sort of got herself sort of installed in the studio, basically overseeing everything that John was doing, even with what the other Beatles were doing, and they found it very, very difficult to get to get on and work with her. So now we have the continuing story of Bungalow. Yeah, again, it's yet another really sort of nursery rhymey type tune here, but macabre. There's a lot of the macabre about this, and a lot of sadness here, and you know, a message here basically: to kill is a sin, you know. And yeah, they're probably quite right there, really, I suppose. While My Guitar Gently Weeps, again, George being philosophical. He didn't have a particularly bright outlook on life, really. Did our George, particularly with I like the spiritual side of George's work, and I'm very, very interested in it and everything. But having said that, it's not exactly saying that life on this planet is a bundle of roses, and a lot of George's songs didn't express this this bunch of roses. While My Guitar Gently Weeps has a solo on it by Eric Clapton, which is the most mournful solo ever. It's very, very good and very, very beautiful, but it's incredibly sad, and it goes up to its top notes, and it's sort of it's crying. It is a guitar crying. Interestingly enough, on the mono version of this song, towards the end, there's no cries of yeah that are on the stereo version. So it's just a purely Eric Clapton solo, and it goes on for a bit longer. One of my favourites is Happiness is a Warm Gun, which is the next track on. It's the last track on album 1. John Lennon, I think, saw or was influenced by Snoopy posters that would have "Love Is" and then a little comment after that, with a picture of Snoopy sitting on top of his kennel or lying on top of his kennel or whatever. And this is his take on that, really. And again, cocking a snook at Vietnam. I would have thought. I've spoken about this one before. There's some bizarre rhythms going ahead on it. There's bits of singing in 3/4 while the drums are playing in 4/4, and 7/8 and 5/8 all over the shop, and very, very well put together. And the most eerie guitar solo on here, where the bass and the lead guitar just seem to slide around, and it sends chills through me. There's something really, really eerie about this whole album. Having said that, we turn over to side 2, and the first thing we've got is Paul McCartney singing a song about his sheepdog. Basically, that's Martha was the name of his sheepdog. Whether or not he used the name of his sheepdog to talk about a real person in the song, or whether he is actually singing about his dog, I don't know. But I like it. It's a lovely song. It's and Paul McCartney singing in the top of his range. He has a very, very high singing voice, and I do like it. But having said that, that absolute contrast between John Lennon's like doom-laden "Happiness is a Warm Gun," and you can almost imagine Nixon, firing a gun and sort of blowing the smoke fumes away from it, sort of, a bit like Elmer Fudd or something like that. And suddenly, Paul McCartney just sort of taking you into his garden or something like that. Just a major kind of contrast there. If this had been 4 Beatles united together recording this album, some of these songs wouldn't be here. And that would be a shame, because it is an absolute masterpiece of an album. You've just got to accept it for where it is, which is in a bit of a nightmare, as far as I can feel. Okay, so what do we get? You know, we got Martha, my dear, dum 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 dum, and then suddenly, dum dum, I'm so tired, I haven't slept a wink. John Lennon, at this time, first experiments with heroin. From if any of my sort of readings around it are correct, he and Yoko were at a party, and Yoko and they were keen to try anything, and I think they had just like the tiniest amount, not enough to even make you sick. And a lot of first time heroin users are sick, and they just had the tiniest amount, and from there they spent the next few months trying to clean up from it. Basically, it's not a good idea, peoples. But this just sounds like a very, very groggy, heroin-addled John Lennon, basically, that cannot settle at all, and writing his song about it, really. Followed by Blackbird. It's just light, dark all the time. I have to listen to Blackbird. The more I listen to it, the more I like it and appreciate it for what it is. There was a time where I thought, this is just a little bit twee or whatever, but certainly, as one man singing against the guitar and maybe the odd sound effects thrown in, it's absolutely stunning work. And it was actually George Michael in the 90s who said that if you really do want to record a song against just the guitar, then the arrangement has to be so perfect, because any loops or any sort of loopholes or mistakes or errors or whatever will show up much more clearly than they would if you've got this great barrage of instruments, and that you can fade this one down here and something else will cover it up or whatever. And Paul McCartney here has just pulled it off absolutely perfectly. There's another song later on where he does a similar sort of thing. But yeah, simple and brilliant, I think. George's second song now, Piggies, which is about vegetarianism. The little piggies are the ones we kill. The bigger piggies are those who do the killing. Again, you see, he was not pulling any punches by this time. He wasn't, writing any within you, without yous, where, yes, you can sort of meditate yourself out of your mind and experience heaven and bliss and everything. All his songs here were basically about the shit that human beings crawl around in. Yes, again, he's right, I think. But, it's not a fun message, I'm afraid, peoples. Put to, in true pop music way, a very, very pretty harpsichordy style tune that again could have been pulled out of a nursery rhyme. There seems to be an awful lot of nursery rhymery sort of stuff going on here, and even John got involved in it a bit later on in the album. Paul McCartney does a country and western style lampoon next called Rocky Raccoon, and it's pretty good. I like the sort of the hoedowny sort of piano da 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 da, and the and the sort of the contrast between that and the actual vocal bit is very good. There's never been a decent sheet music arrangement of it, I'm afraid. But yeah, I think that's probably just a little bit throwaway. Had there been 4 Beatles working together, that would have been one that I think would probably not have made it there. And the same with the next one, really. Don't Pass Me By. You see, now Ringo was getting involved quite a lot in country music. This is English music. It's country music in the fact that it's got a slidey around hillbilly style violin playing all over the shop, which by the way is different in the mono version, and the mono version runs slightly faster. But underneath it, it really doesn't sound country music at all. You certainly couldn't imagine this being played in Nashville, Tennessee, or on the sort of the background of a Dukes of Hazzard soundtrack or something like that, because it's too English for that. But full marks for Ringo for writing a song there, and it's it's okay. It's pretty good, really. I suppose other people writing songs, probably couldn't do much worse, really. Sorry, Ringo. John Lennon just starting his peace campaign here, in the late 60s. All sorts of things going wrong here for the Beatles in terms of their unifiedness, and one of them is the fact that John and Paul are having this rift, and Yoko Ono is encouraging and daring John to move on and on and on, ever onward. Round about this time, I don't know exactly when, whether it was slightly before or slightly after, but John was going to have his photograph taken naked with Yoko, and it was on their first solo album together, and it had to be sold in brown paper bags. What else was going on here? George and Ringo were getting muddled up with whose wife was who, and all sorts of strange things were going on here. And Paul McCartney could be quite bitchy in the way that he responded to some of it. There was no sense really here that publicly he was standing up for anything that John did. And this is, why don't we do it in the road? No one will be watching us. Why don't we do it in the road? And to me, it just sounds like Paul is just taking the piss out of John Lennon here. And would that have been another song that would have been written and would have been on this album had the four of them been together? Very interesting sort of thing to look at. Has an amazing heavy drum beat, and even in the mono version, which isn't as powerful as the stereo version, but you just hear it thumping, and again, depending on which accounts you read, this was about the time that the Beatles started to use 8-track tape recording in their studio. Some of the songs are 4-track, some of them are 8-track. But once they had 8-track, they started to layer, almost to taking the mickey kind of levels. And Ringo found himself, found his drums quite often just disappearing in the mix because of what was, being buried on top of them. And so there are instances of where where Ringo has been quoted as saying that he was even playing on things like biscuit tins and chairs and stuff like that, just having to sort of thump out the meter again so that more stuff could be layered on top of them. And this actually sounds, why don't we do it in the road, actually sounds like that sort of thing going on. Where are we? I Will. Lovely, and most notable, I think, for the fact that the bass is almost absent here, and it's just Paul going dum, 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 dum. Starts a bit later on the mono version, after the first verse, but very, very simple song again, and another one where the arrangement would have had to have been absolutely perfect, followed by John Lennon singing Julia. And this is John Lennon at his most perfect. He sounds like he's going to break down and cry, almost, really, because of what's going on here. Julia was the name of his mother. His mother was knocked over by an off-duty policeman and died. A drunk off-duty policeman driving along. Think about 1957 or something like that. So it would have been quite raw in his mind. It's only, it's not even really, there's not enough time, 10 years or so would have gone past, during which time his entire life has been transformed by whatever is the Beatles. And here he is saying, Julia, his mum, I've found somebody else. And it's almost like I'm showing you, this is my new girlfriend. Okay? But because of this because I found this new love. It's almost like I don't want to be torn away from you, but I feel myself being torn away from you. Okay, I'm singing a song of love just to reach you, Julia. Okay, so is he seeking his mother's approval? I don't know. I don't think Aunt Mimi, who brought him up for most of his life, I don't think she would be very approving. And this is almost like, perhaps maybe, if my mum were here now, that I would get some sort of approval, some sort of support from her. Okay, so side 3 opens with Birthday, which is just, I think it's just a pretty groovy, cool song, really. And another not quite so well known Beatles song. Sounds good in mono, actually. There are some in the stereo version. There are quite a few very obvious edits in it, which, because of the way that mono is, everything all piled up into one speaker. It's that the edits are sort of covered up a little bit, and the backing vocals stand out better and seem to be more reverberant. I like it. Your Blues, on the other hand, is John Lennon being absolutely and thoroughly miserable here. I'm lonely, wanna die. If I ain't dead already, girl, you know the reason why. Okay? Meaning that, she is the only person that is actually supporting him here. Extremely, I think it's brilliant in the way that it sort of melds sort of Bob Dylan together, but you've also with these sort of very bluesy things going on, a bit like trying to think of the guy Robert Johnson, I think from about the 1920s 30s, was like a bluesy sort of guitar player sort of thing. You can imagine him singing this sort of thing, and it's almost it's very black and very dark. I don't think it is too wrong to say that a lot of these blues artists that were just basically singing about how awful life was, they'd actually like sold their soul in a very real sense, and that's why their songs were coming out so black. And this is John aping them, and we've got these very contrasting moods, a bit like he would do later on with I Want You, She's So Heavy. This is sort of a precursor of that, really. There are some strange edits in here where like perhaps he sang the wrong lyrics or whatever and thought, oh, perhaps I won't get away with those sort of thing, but there are still traces of those lyrics in later verses, so you could almost try and work out what's going on there, and work out what the lyrics are. On the Beatles Anomaly site, I think they've tried to do that quite a lot. But that just adds to the hauntingness of it and the eeriness of it. I love it. I absolutely love it. But he was in a very, very dark place, and make no mistake about it. While he was recording that. Paul McCartney, dark. Birthday, Paul McCartney, light. Your Blues, about as low as you could possibly get. I want to die. Don't really want to face another day. Mother Nature's son, Paul McCartney now. He was, again, you see, as far as the fans were concerned, it would have been a bit of a disappointment that he didn't marry his longtime girlfriend, Jane Asher, who was a famous actress over here. So he's sort of met Linda McCartney by this time. I don't know whether or not they've actually quite got their relationship together here, but certainly the fans that used to hang around outside Paul McCartney's house noted that he started to, whereas before when he was with Jane, he was a very, very dapper man, very, very trendy, and that sort of thing. Now he's not shaving, he's coming out, with his hair unwashed, wearing the same old coat and that sort of thing. And even this picture of him here is him unshaven and slightly greasy hair look and whatever, which was a change in him. And so for him to sing Mother Nature's Son here is basically him saying, look, I'm going back to nature, folks. And he and Linda would decide, to become very famous vegetarians. And this song, again, is, I suppose, expressing all that. And I think it's absolutely gorgeous. Very, very beautiful song. Probably more durable, in a sense, than even Blackbird, I think. Lovely. I don't really know what Everybody's Got Something to Hide except for Me and My Monkey's all about, except that it's sort of rock and roll, but it's sort of harking back. In a way, it reminds me of some of the stuff that's on Revolver, like maybe She Said, or what's the other one? Da 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 da, and Your Bird Can Sing, or something like that, where you've got these sort of really sort of boiled up liquid electric guitars that are just sort of basically it's great, but I really haven't got a clue what he's going on about. However, the next song, Sexy Sadie, is this came directly out of the Maharishi visit in India, and he wrote this song because he was so disillusioned by the Maharishi. There's a story that goes that John tried to wangle himself a helicopter ride. Obviously we're all being very austere here. We're not even having sex, peoples. Dear Prudence, whatever. But the Maharishi's here he's got a bloody great helicopter, and I want to ride in that helicopter because at least you take me away and just tell me what the secret is, because I'm not getting anything from here. So look, I believe that somewhere you've got a lot of power, but tell me what the secret is. And he never got that far, and so he left. He took Cynthia back. Possibly there was a bit of I'm missing Yoko in there as well, because certainly the Yoko Ono thing sort of blew up very, very shortly after the Maharishi trip. This album was released, by the way, in November, late October, early November. But the songs that I'm talking about that were written in India were sort of around about March. Okay. By the time this had been released, Cynthia was, their marriage was over and he was with Yoko. This was the first one that the fans would have had to have contended with, where you didn't have this lovely John, Cynthia, Julian sort of marriage sort of thing, which a lot of fans at that time would have found quite acceptable, really, because, divorce at the time, certainly in the UK, it just wasn't done. And, so there was a lot of enmity for Yoko just for the fact that she was seen as a marriage wrecker. And similarly with Linda McCartney, a lot of fans couldn't get on with that one either. Certainly couldn't get on with Paul for, ever letting that sort of fall to pieces. But here, Sexy Sadie is all about that trip. And he had to rewrite the lyrics almost and put because Sexy Sadie, Maharishi, Sexy Sadie, it would fit together. And it had a few "see you next Tuesday" kind of words for what the Maharishi was there. And there's and I think there's some sort of footage somewhere where Paul is actually saying, "Yeah, we go on record and call him a cunt." Oh, sorry, I just said a rude word. Oh, if anyone's watching who knows me, I don't normally say that word, but you. he had to be persuaded against, and he was still somehow in awe of the Maharishi and thought, yes, he did have some sort of power or whatever. And this song, You Made a Fool of Everyone, he had to sort of calm it, tone it right down. You made a fool of everyone, you laid it down for all to see. Sexy Sadie, you're the latest, you're the greatest of them all. I think it's a brilliant track. I absolutely adore it, and the piano in it is just delicious. And the way that the music just wants to go on and on and on and on and on, and it's almost like a song that you knew even before it had been written. The way that it's the way that the chords are structured. A superb song. One of these things that are just never ever ever going to end. But yeah, I mean, I don't think that he dissed Hinduism as such, because certainly the following year he and George were chanting Hare Krishna together and what have you, but at this point he was certainly saying, well, the Maharishi, if you're looking for it in the Maharishi, it isn't there, and he made a few allegations that perhaps were not entirely founded and were perhaps quite hurtful, I think, to the people that were concerned about it. So yeah, that's Sexy Sadie. Then is essentially cocking a snook at the Maharishi. Helter Skelter, I think, was it the Rolling Stones, something like that? They came on the radio and said, we've just made a record that is just the biggest load of noise that you've ever heard. And Paul McCartney said, oh yeah, right. And then he went into the studio and wanted to do exactly the same thing. And this song is almost could have been written by John, very, very heavily influenced by them, I think, really, or by John. And I think they would have probably had quite a lot of fun making it, really. I absolutely love it. When I first heard it, I think it must have been about 11 or 12 or something like that, I found it a little bit difficult to stomach because I was a kid and I was still going around singing Oh Bloody Oh Blada. But this Helter Skelter is just the total opposite of Paul, really, showing that he could just dabble into any kind of music making he wanted to do. And this is just crazy. And this was the other song, Piggies and Helter Skelter, I think. These were the two that sort of, while that, I think it was a Sharon Tate murders or something like that. This guy heard them basically while he was on acid and found that in those two songs in particular there were instructions on how to carry out this murder. Yeah, bizarre. Don't do drugs, people. They're a bit peculiar, really. The mono version of Helter Skelter is different from the stereo version. In that it goes into that there's an edit about 3 minutes 10 seconds or something like that into the song, and whereas in the mono version it's edited back to sort of the first verse with a few effects sort of layered on the top. They later improved on it when they did the stereo thing, and this must have been like a huge jam, and so they must have just edited back to a different part of this jam. By which time Ringo then, I think, is it Ringo or something, said, I've got blisters and my fingers are sore, and that was sort of used to end that particular song. You don't hear that shout on the mono version, and the Helter Skelter on the mono version is a lot shorter, which I think is a bit of a shame, but. It's still pretty good. If you go onto the Anomalies thing, I think it's called What Goes On. If you go onto their website, you'll actually find out what all the because there's bits where Paul McCartney is going right up close to the microphone and sort of and then they've distorted it and everything. But they actually do translate exactly what he's saying there. Okay, then one of my very favourites of this LP, which is Long, Long, Long. I think this could probably count as my favourite because the place that it takes you here, it's just this sort of, I don't know, this very darkened. I don't mean dark in a bad sense. I mean it in quite a good sense, a very peaceful sense, and it's almost sort of the only bit of the album where you're suddenly being transcended above the shit that is going on in people's lives at that time. 68 was my year of birth, really. I mean, that should be enough to tell you that a lot of dark things were going on, people's, and that song, it's just beautiful. Takes me well out of, it just lifts me out of whatever crap I'm in at the time or whatever. And at the end you can hear, I think there was an alarm clock left on top of an organ, and it just rattles, and they left it on there. Was it an alarm clock or a bottle or something like that? It was just left on top of the organ, and when they hit this note, it resonated and made it rattle, and they left it on because they thought it was quite good. Okay, side 4. When we are now, you've patient, people. I'm 49 and a half minutes long here, but we're now getting to the real crux of this album. It's taken 3 sides of very, very disparate stuff, but suddenly, somehow or other, this whole thing is coming together. And I'll tell you now my 2 magical musical moments on this album, which sort of, I suppose, they merge together to make one, and that is Revolution 9 and Goodnight. So we'll tell you how we lead up to there. Starting off with Revolution 1. For those of you who've heard the single, there are 3 versions of Revolution. There's Revolution that was on a single. It was on the B-side of Hey Jude. And it was a very rock and roll-y thing. It was written after Revolution 1. Revolution 1 was the same song, but sort of in a very sort of shooby-doo-wah, shooby-doo-wah sort of mode, sort of very cabaret sort of thing. At the time, John Lennon wasn't quite sure, really, whether or not, in certain cases, violence and aggression were justified. And so he did, but when you talk about destruction, don't you know that you can count me out in... Don't you know it's gonna be... And so the Revolution 1, he's not sure either way. By the time you've got to the rock and roll version, which is not on here, as I say, B-side of Hey Jude is when you go for that, he wants definitely out. Okay? Because, you know, you've got a lot of Eastern Europe here now that is in revolution. And you know, and you've got student uprisings and whatever, and you know the commies, or communists, that you know, quelling all these revolutions and things, and suddenly all these countries are becoming part of you know, the Soviet Union and whatever, and you know, John seeing all of this and thinking, well, you know, what's a revolution? You know, what will it be like? But it will be all right. Okay, it will be all right. Don't you know it's going to be all right? Don't you know it's going to be all right? And that is more of a mantra in this song. Okay, because in the backing vocals, in the rock and roll version, it's don't you know it's going to be all right, all right, all right, like that. But here you've got the don't you know it's going to be being repeated as well in the backing vocals, so it's becoming more like a mantra here that is going on. Okay, brilliant. Okay, love it, love it, love it, love it, love it. Okay, so you've got that version of Revolution. You've then got, as I say, the rock and roll version of Revolution and Revolution 9, which is going to come on later, and I'll talk about that in a second. All right. After Revolution 1, we've got Honey Pie, which is Paul McCartney again. You know, this is him sort of doing another sort of Penny Laney sort of thing. You know, going back into the sort of the land of his grandparents, and how, you know, people would sail across from New York and wherever and end up in the Liverpool ports and everything. And you know, this song sort of reminds me of that sort of thing, where you would have, you know, someone that you know, from New York meeting someone in Liverpool, and you know, and having this sort of very twee sort of romance about it. And yeah, it's nice and everything. It's the breath of daylight that this side of the song, of the album, really needs, because it's going into very, very hellish kind of waters here, because you've got political unrest in John Lennon's Revolution 1. You've now got this total fantasy of Honey Pie that's, you know, harking back to the 1920s, and you've even got a crackly 78 record thing, which, you know, on this particular copy of the album is a bit lost because it's so crackly anyway. And then George Harrison, who's visiting Eric Clapton's house for dinner one night, looking at the chocolates on the table, whatever, and he's now sort of basically writing this song, which is ostensibly about a box of chocolates, because all the names of the chocolates that are in the box are somehow crammed into this song, you know, cream tangerine, Montélimar, and all this sort of thing, because Eric Clapton had a very sweet tooth. and so they just ate puddings and chocolates and things like that. And George Harrison is, in his very cheerful way, saying, if you're going to eat a lot of pudding, you are going to pay for it somehow or other. And in his, his sort of humorous mind, he's saying, well, the way you're going to pay for that is by going to the dentist and having all your teeth pulled out. This is, I suppose, the message that perhaps our government should be listening to now, when it's saying, right, if you're going to live off the fat of the land and half the world's going to be starving, at some point you are going to have to pay for that. Hence, recessions and double dip recessions and all the shit that we're going through now in terms of money and everything. That's all in this song, and it's basically karma. Being sort of, a lesson on karma being sort of given through here. All right, Savoy Truffle, fantastic song again. Very sort of soulful and bluesy and rock and rolly, with a very Englishy style lyric on. George Harrison was fantastic at being English, and very dry, in his sense of humour at a time, where perhaps soul and whatever was, sort of American style, diners and this, that and the other. And George Harrison, could sing about a box of chocolates. But there you go. On the mono version of this, after the guitar solo sounds slightly different because of the prominence that certain instruments have been given in the mix. But then, for some reason or other, the organ drops out. And you might think, oh well, I perhaps in amongst all that I wouldn't notice one organ, but once you've listened to the stereo version enough, you do notice that has dropped out, and it's very noticeable by its absence. All right, so there's Savoy Truffle, giving us his lesson on karma, which is quite doom and gloomy, really. And then suddenly we've got John Lennon singing "Cry Baby Cry," another nursery style thing. Cry baby cry, make your mother sigh, she's old enough to know better, so cry baby cry. And all sorts of almost like Sing a Song of Sixpence. The King was here, the Queen was there, the Duchess of Kilcarly was here. Beg your pardon here. But doesn't it really, to me, sounds very weird, the way that the drums all crash around. We've got this minor key which is descending, dun 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 dun, and which is, as I've spoken about before, when you get these descending melodies, especially in the bass, it does give you a sense of foreboding, gloom and doom. With these drums all crashing around, it's a bit like A Day in the Life, really, which was a bit sort of apocalyptic, really, in its sense. And this is like, it's almost like sort of dispelling the myth of the happy family and even in sort of Fantasyland, sort of Alice in Wonderlandy sort of stuff, whatever. And kind of like dispelling the myth or bringing you back into reality, okay? And to cap all that, suddenly there's this, don't know what it is really, it's just a fragment of a song which could possibly have, found its way onto Abbey Road, were it not on here, onto the medley part of Abbey Road. But Paul is always trying to go back to happier days and this sort of thing. Cry Baby Cry ain't going to happen really, folks. We might have a nursery rhymey sort of lyric here, but we've got the music in the background, which is basically cracking any myth of the fact that anything, any part of any fantasy is ever going to come true. And Paul McCartney, can you take me back where I came from? Brother, can you take me back? Can you take me where I came from? Brother, can you take me back? Can you take me back? And that is all it is. And except in tune. And just with a guitar. Alright? No one even really knows how on earth or why that came from. But that is part of Cry Baby Cry. And it's almost like, Paul McCartney daydreaming, John Lennon, trying to get to reality and that, and trying to break a few myths, really, a bit like Glass Onion, I suppose. Cry Baby Cry. So then this Can You Take Me Back thing, which is not listed on the album at all, and then we suddenly get into Revolution number 9. Now, I think the story behind it is that the versions of Revolution 1, i.e. the how side 4 starts, the sort of shooby dooby kind of version of Revolution 1, the takes sort of broke down into sort of absolute chaos and went on for, you know, about 20 minutes or so. And from those that sort of abject chaos of that recording, they hived off the song and kept that, and then used the basis of the rest of it to do Revolution 9, which is basically lots and lots and lots of tapes and different scenarios and things. It sounds like people are going out to dinner. Sounds like they've taken bits off the news. George Harrison has contributed little bits of conversation and stuff like that, and then it's all been mangled into, you know, various different things, and you've got all kinds of sound effects coming here, from here, there, and everywhere, and it makes this like 8 or 9 minute long cacophony of noise, which wherever, and I absolutely adore it, and for me it is a magical musical moment. Every time I listen to this album, I find something else that is different that I didn't hear before, that throws its attention at me. And I don't think there's any amount of analysing or anything that you could do that would ever make this song a completely familiar thing, because it's just this, you know, great sort of, it's just absolutely wonderful. Nobody wanted it at the time, obviously. If the 4 Beatles had been the 4 Beatles and George Martin had been, you know, supervising them all and had, you know, having this wonderful creative burst with all 4 of them, it would have been amazing. It would have been wonderful. But unfortunately, that wasn't how it was going on, you see. John was away in other studios recording Revolution 9 while Paul would have been putting the touches to Obla Di Obla Da or something like that. And it's just, there's also, it just seems to me, this great sort of hypocrisy that's going on about this, because in the mid-60s, Paul McCartney and his sort of circle of friends, like the Dunbars in this sort of art gallery and whatever, they'd go around their mates' flats and whatever, and they would have, you know, red wine, smoke a few joints, and they would make these loops of tapes that would, you know, that were pure music concrete, in sort of, you know, the Schoenbergy sort of form and that sort of thing, and you know, and they were seen as the arty Beatles, really, you know, because all the others had bought houses that were sort of outside London. Paul lived in St John's Wood, a few doors out away from the studio. You know, in his social life, you know, he could go into the centre of London, whatever, and be amongst all the arty fartiness and everything, making these, you know, bizarre pieces of music and tape loops and stuff like that. A lot of which ended up on tracks like Tomorrow Never Knows. And I think they got a load of them out again for Octopus's Garden. But suddenly or other, he's fighting tooth and nail that John Lennon is not going to get Revolution 9 on the album. Well, thankfully John won here. But this is the state that the Beatles were in at the time. You know, that, you know, Revolution 9 is, you know, extremely controversial in amongst even the Beatles, and they didn't even, you know, not all of them wanted it there. And, you know, it's you know, yeah, it's very sad in a way, but having said that, thank goodness it is there, because it's an absolutely stunning piece, and just listen to it, but don't have any conceptions of the fact that you're going to get a brilliant piece of, you know, conventional music here. You know, turn the lights off, you know, have a glass of wine or whatever, and just listen to that piece of music on its own. Well, don't listen to it on its own. Don't listen to this side of the album on its own, or if you've got the time, listen to the whole album on its own and feel this climax and this doom that is approaching. Finally, the side 4, suddenly number 9, number 9, number 9, number 9, number 9, and you know, all these crashes and bangs all around you, and Yoko Ono saying we could become naked, and you've got cries of, you know, revolutionary cries and shouts going on around you and everything. And then suddenly it all dies down, and in the very best in the very best sort of, we have this program called Crime Watch over here. You know, you see the worst things that could possibly go on, and then the presenter at the end says, you know, this, you know, these are the worst crimes that you could think of, whatever. You know, they don't happen everywhere, so, you know, night night, and don't have nightmares. Don't have nightmares. And Ringo, the cute Beatle here, after all this crap that has gone on in the Beatles' relationships, in the whole world and everything, and the Beatles making this completely stark album here, you know, stark album colours, the 60s, the summer of love, it's over, folks. It's over. Look, this is the shit that we're dealing with today, folks. And these great big sort of swings of light and dark that are macabre in their proportions. And suddenly, at the end, Ringo Starr singing, I think it's John Lennon's song, about, you know, just going to sleep and good night, everybody. And isn't it lovely? And there's this beautiful orchestration by George Martin and everything, and it's absolutely lovely. But it's like, it's almost that don't have nightmares, people, kind of ends to this album, and in that sense, it is almost macabre. It is almost macabre because it's actually saying to you, you live in a shit world, people. You live in a very, very difficult world. But, you know, let's go to sleep on it. You know, and when you wake up in the morning, you'll turn over back to side 1 of this album and play back in the USSR again, because you know, yeah, and you're back into, you know, the shit politics of the world, really. And this has been 1 hour and 6 minutes. I do hope I haven't put you off this album. Don't have nightmares, folks. I'm really, really sorry about the light. It's getting very, very dark outside even, and there's not really an awful lot I can do about it yet. But just go and listen to that album, you know. Just turn the lights off and everything and just listen to that album, because it's just absolutely stunning. And there's always, as I say, I mean, Revolution 9 being the case in point, but there's always something new that is going to be lifted in there. And, you know, transferring this for my friends into mono, I've suddenly become, you know, fully aware of the weight of some of the drums and things on here, and you know, and how sort of shrieky and scary some of this stuff is, you know, particularly some of the electric guitars and what have you. I'm going on too long. Goodbye, namaste, Hare Krishna. See you later.